John, as you were setting the scene for the Magna Carta, you explained that it was a piece of parchment effectively, marked in a field outside London near Runnymede, nearby Windsor Castle in June 2015. Now, you set the scene for this historic piece as a rather unassuming meadow next to the Thames. Now, you'd imagine that such an important place for Western civilization would be, I don't know, commemorated in some way by the English. They'd have some kind of massive shrine or a building or a park. How did the Brits honour their sacred place for democracy?
Well, that's a great question. And for many years, the Magna Carta wasn't talked about for the first 50 to 100 years because it was part of an ongoing debate between kings and barons and magnates. But it was then only later, as people were trying to assert their rights against overbearing kings, that the Magna Carta became as important as it is. So today there's a plaque, today there's a small pergola where they think the Magna Carta was agreed to, but we're not sure because the course of the River Thames has moved, the area was flooded, and interestingly, there's even debate around when the Magna Carta was agreed. Some people think it was the 15th of June, other eminent historians say it was a few days later. So it's not unlike the Declaration of Independence in some ways because there's debate around how exactly that was agreed to. So it's interesting that something becomes as symbolic and as important as this, but it starts off rather small. And it's an interesting example of how we invent our own history. We go back into history to find antecedents for things that we have always regarded as important. And one of the things that occurred to the Magna Carta in the 16th and 17th century was this debate about what it actually was. Where did the rights come from? And there were quite a number of historians at the time who said the Anglo-Saxons have always had these rights, and it was the evil Norman kings who came and imposed themselves on us. And so there's arguments that in Anglo-Saxon times there were the beginnings of a parliament, there was the beginnings of a council around the king, and it was only foreign invaders that took away the birthright of the British. One of the things that those historians don't mention is that when the Normans arrived in 1066 in Britain, some 10% of the population, of that 2 million population were slaves. And one of the things that isn't much talked about is that for all of the faults of the Norman kings, what they ended was slavery in Britain, which was widely practiced by the Anglo-Saxons at the time.
Well, what I find really interesting, well, actually, the moment when I was reading your book and I decided that, yes, I was going to spend the rest of my beach holiday finishing it, was when I saw that it was the Americans who ended up building the shrine to commemorate the Magna Carta. And now it's got a little message that says, to commemorate Magna Carta, symbol of freedom under law. They were quite disturbed when they found out the Brits hadn't done anything about it. And as we know, Americans take liberty quite seriously, and they were determined that there would be some mark for this wonderful thing. Now, what's especially interesting is the state of Britain when this document was signed. In that meadow, it was chosen for strategic purposes because the king was warring with the barons and they wanted to feel safe when they were meeting. They couldn't be encircled by another army. Now, John, it's astonishing how much of Western civilization's peaceful and libertarian ideas were forged in the middle of conflict.
Well, that is so often the case as we seek to end conflict. And it's sometimes conflicts, rebellions, revolts, where we begin to understand what is important. And I think you put your finger on something so important, and many of the British have talked about this, that it was the Americans, exactly as you said, who thought, well, we need to do something in this special place. And for the Americans who perhaps take freedom a little bit more importantly and value it a bit more highly than the British through their War of Independence, through the Civil War, through conflicts in the First and Second World War, who've understood that it's in conflict we are tested, and it is in conflict, hopefully, where there's some resolution that emerges. And one of the things that we take for granted in Australia is because we have been largely conflict-free, we haven't had to fight for our democracy. We haven't had to fight for freedom of speech. We haven't had to fight for freedom of religion. We tend to think, that governments are always benign, and that is not the case. We tend to think that we can take freedom of speech and freedom of thought for granted, and that's not the case. And we can look at Australia today as we see the government, for example, with ever-expanding plans to censor the internet. And we need to understand that the freedoms we enjoy came with the British, came with British settlement, and were fought for, and people died for them. And so it's incumbent upon us to recognise that, respect that, and not let our freedoms go the way of freedoms as they have in other parts of the world.